Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to CSIS on a gray and rainy Friday afternoon. My name is Seth Center. I'm the director of the project on history and strategy here. We do our best every once in a while in think tanks to talk history rather than the present, and that means not talking about what happened yesterday, but things that happened even longer ago. That's history too. This is, of course, this November is the 30th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall. Of course, that series of events ended remarkably peacefully, in spite of the enormous pressure on the governments in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union to react to protests that were a challenge to their regimes. And a couple months ago, we had Condoleezza Rice and Philip Zelikow here to talk about those events. They were involved as policymakers at the time. And one issue that kept coming up as they were talking about the statecraft of that time period was why the China model was not deployed in Eastern Europe in November 1989. And of course, the shadow of the events of June of 1989 hung over the decision-making process, particularly of the Eastern Bloc leaders and the Soviet leaders as they were looking at these protests. And so the question from a historian's perspective is, what was the China model? Why did the Chinese choose the China model in June of 1989? Were they aware even that they were making a purposeful choice? What do we know about the decision-making within the Chinese Communist Party leading up to the events? And what do we still need to know from a historical perspective 30 years later? And we're delighted today to have Professor Andrew Nathan with us to help us understand that. He, of course, was one of the editors of the Tiananmen papers in 2001 that provide some really unique insights into the decision-making from the time. And there's a new work out, The Last Secret, which provides an even more documentary evidence for the events of June 1989. And so he and Jude Blanchette, our resident expert on the CCP, are going to have a terrific conversation. We'll try and keep it focused on history if we can. I'm sure not all of you are here to talk about the past, but we'll do our best. And I do think, the 30-year anniversary, historians like to talk in 10s, 20s, 30s, decades. It's a good time to commemorate something and look back. It's an even number. But for American historians, 30 years is important because that's basically when you start to get access to declassified documents. You're able to start to reconstruct in a meaningful way, based on evidence, what the government did, why it did it, and you can start to triangulate journalistic accounts, memoirs, biography with real evidence, and then produce, basically, start to get closer and closer to historical objectivity. It is much harder to do in authoritarian states. It's much harder to do that in places that don't have archives and freedom of information and declassification. And so I do think we have a great opportunity here to talk about events that are much harder to talk about in other places. We have a great opportunity to do so with rigor and historical objectivity and professional standards. And so I'm really grateful that Professor Nathan is willing to join us, explain what happened, why it happened, what's left to be known about what happened, and then how we can draw direct linkages between what happened in 1989 and today. We'll take about 45 minutes of conversation with Jude and Andy, and then we'll do question and answer. Our terrific team here has put out question cards. Write on them, send them to the end, and after about 45 minutes, we'll open it up for questions, and then we will finish up about 3:45. So thank you all.
Seth, that was a great introduction, which actually saves me reading my whole introduction, so I will just dive right in. Adding the point that for those of you thinking about the paper, they must be censoring the questions. The answer is no. It's just that we don't trust you to ask concise, short questions. So that's why we do the paper. Again, I think Seth did a really good job of laying out why we're talking about this today, 30 years on. This is one of the most important moments in modern China's history. Obviously, the debate in China is constrained by the political environment, which is why it's our historical and ethical responsibility to be discussing this out of China, because what happened in that period in mid-1989 is extraordinarily important, not just for the United States, but for the world. And so, as Seth said, we're going to keep this primarily historical, but we're not, because obviously hanging over this is the so what, why does this matter, what are the legacies of Tiananmen Square, where are we seeing parallels to Tiananmen Square, some of the elements of the Chinese system which were capable of unleashing violence on Chinese citizens in the summer of 1989, where are those elements still existing today in China? And I'm thinking, of course, about recent reports coming out about Xinjiang and down south, where the framing of issues in Hong Kong, of course, is about this question we keep asking of, will they send in the People's Liberation Army? We can debate whether those are the right framings, and I'd be happy to offline at another point, but or in written question. But those, I think, are why we're so interested in this extraordinarily important topic. So we're going to start, I think, in the period before Tiananmen Square, June 4th, because that didn't just emerge out of nowhere, it didn't explode out of a vacuum, but there were a series of building tensions within society and China's political system. And so I wanted to ask Professor Nathan if we could sort of rewind the clock back 12 months or so from June 3rd, June 4th, and if you can set the scene for what's happening in Chinese domestic politics within society, what pressures, in retrospect, do we now understand we're starting to build the summer or so before?
Yeah, so in preparing for today, I looked back at something I had written in 1988, and I just sent it to you guys from the train. But I visited China in 1988, and I came back and I was asked to write a chapter, China in 1988, for Asia in 88 kind of yearbook that the Asia Society used to then publish every year. And when I was there, and I said in this article, which I'd be happy to share with any of you, that there was a sense of unease when I visited that I could sense. And it had something to do with the fact that Zhao Ziyang was the premier and he was the implementer. Deng Xiaoping had this idea that we need to modernize, we need to reform and modernize and get to be rich. And the way to do that is to somehow open up the country to the globe and so forth. And Deng's ideas were pretty vague, and Zhao Ziyang had a lot of advisors who were young professional economists. There's a very nice book by Julian Gewirtz about how Zhao Ziyang sought advice from Western economists, Milton Friedman and James Tobin and so forth. So they were doing what Deng called crossing the river by feeling the stones. And in 1988, Zhao's advisors said that if we're going to break through, they had had 10 years of reform by that time, if we're going to really break through the next stage and make the SOEs efficient, we're going to have price reform and enterprise reform. And so Zhao went to Deng and said, my advisors are telling me, so price reform meant there had been government had set the prices of everything and they wanted to move to market prices, and they had a dual track system at that time, which meant that some products iron and steel and rubber and so forth were available on state prices, and then some excess were on market prices, and that caused a lot of corruption and it allowed the inefficient SOEs to be protected. So Zhao went to Deng and said, we need to, and Deng said, okay, open up the price system. And this caused a kind of panic buying, and so corruption and then inflation, and then Deng said, and the conservatives in the leadership said, this is going too far, too fast, and Deng stopped the price reform. So there was this sense that we've had reform for 10 years, we're partway there, and now we don't know which way to go, because if we go this way, it's inflation, if we go that way, it's stagnation. And there was also, had been this opening and closing politically. They had, Deng said, practice is the sole criterion of truth, and then a lot of people started writing critical things, and then the conservatives came to Deng and said, we're surrounded by disloyal intellectuals, and so he cracked down, opening, cracking, and they purged Liu Binyan and Fang Lijie and one other, I forget, Wu Zhuguang, from the party for saying things. And so there was this sense that we're blocked from any kind of progress. And in that year, some of you may remember that a group of liberal intellectuals created a TV series called River Elegy, Heshang, that went on TV that spoke in very poetic terms about basically Chinese civilization being a closed-in peasant civilization that needs to open up. It was a complete negation, not just of, or not even of communism, but just of Chinese civilization. There was this feeling of really, a strong word, but I would say despair among at least the intellectuals. So it was a very bad feeling. I didn't foresee anything like Tiananmen, but I published this article, and I can send it to you, in which I said things are really very uneasy in China. That was 1988. It was intellectual, it was cultural, it was economic, it was political. And just one more sentence is to say that was the last year of the 10th year of many struggles, every year, every month, in the leadership about what's the way forward, which Zhao wrote about in a memoir called Prisoner of the State, that was published in English after he was in house arrest. He recorded these reminiscences. So there had been a lot of struggle for 10 years, and then this sense we've hit a wall.
Before we move on to events of spring of 1989, can you talk a bit about, you mentioned conservatives. Can you unpack a little bit of the political ecosystem leading up to 1989? We talk about ideas of factions, but I think simplistically, right, we talk about there were liberal reformers and there were conservatives.
Yeah.
Can you give a little bit more granularity, or can you describe a little bit more what the political forces were like throughout the 1980s?
Yeah.
Because I think in the stripped down version, Mao dies, Deng comes to power,
and we
the
have
1980s,
reform.
blah, 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 then 1989.
Yeah.
But it was a little bit more
So,
complicated.
there was a real trade-off, a real dilemma that would face China at the end of the Mao period, is that we've got to modernize, we've got to raise the standard of living of our people, we've got to grow the GNP so we can have a military and stuff like that. And the only visible way to do that anybody knew. So back in the 1950s, when Mao put in state planning, really the only intellectually respectable way to develop a country was state planning, because obviously capitalism was bankrupt and the Soviet Union had used state planning. But in 1978, 79, 1980, it was exactly the opposite, that state planning was had proven itself to be a failure. And when you looked around at South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, and Singapore and so forth, what had been a success for development was globalization. So one thing that faced China as a necessity was we've got to globalize, and that means the market, and it means foreign investment, and it means the coastal, opening up what eventually in 1988 was the whole coastal region to foreign investment, having joint ventures and so on and so forth. But on the other side was the dilemma that if you do that, you're committing a kind of political suicide, because you are selling what turned out to be labor power, essentially, to the capitalists who will exploit it. You're liberalizing your intellectual world, the party intellectuals and novels and movies and colleges and media. You're opening those up to foreign influences in a situation in which the Chinese leadership believed, as they do today, that China's surrounded by enemies who want to keep it down. So which is the right way? So can you combine these two things? So Deng Xiaoping vaguely felt, I think, that somehow you can combine one-party rule and discipline with globalization and high-tech modernization. And he believed we're going to do both of these things. But in fact, that would always create a lot of dissent from the people who said, well, now you're selling out we shed blood for this revolution, and now you're selling out our working class to the foreigners to be exploited, and you're allowing the intellectuals who don't love communism to say everything that they want. And then the others, I guess I'm on the wrong side, those would be the conservatives. And then the liberals, younger, sort of Western-oriented liberals, saying, if you guys don't embrace like what they used to call what was the term? There's a term in Marx for the rules of economics. I forget the exact translation now. Objective rules of economics, which call for the market and so forth. We're never going to modernize. So it was a true dilemma, and both branches of that dilemma were voiced by different people. So the conservatives, for example, Chen Yun was, senior leader with equal authority to Deng, really, a little bit older than Deng, who was very, very suspicious of just opening up the market and what these young economists are saying, what do they know? And somebody like Deng Lichun was an ideological conservative who felt that, as I said, we shed blood for the ideal, and now all of a sudden you want to give up on the ideal. And these people, as Jude's book says, what is it called, Red Guards, the new Red Guard?
Yes.
Book plug for Jude.
Yeah, I didn't know this is book ads right here.
That debate is still there, completely still there now. It's not political because Xi Jinping won't allow it. And I think one of the reasons that he's centralized so much power is his idea is implement, do it. My orders, do it. So he doesn't want all this left-right debate because it just puts sand in the gears. But the debate happens, but it can't enter the political zone.
Final scene setter before we get to the meat of this. Can you talk a bit about how the Communist Party was throughout the 1980s interpreting events happening in the Soviet Union? So not only do we have the reforms initiated by Gorbachev, but then towards the period we're talking about, we're seeing the slow dissolution, or we're seeing a rise in political contestation in states around the Soviet Union. How is the leadership interpreting that?
So
Did they think it's coming to us next?
This is a great question to which I don't have an answer, because I don't know. What I do know about the period leading up to 1989, and I think the primary, a concern of Chinese policymakers with respect to the Soviet Union was the so-called normalization of party-to-party relations. Gorbachev had come to power in 1985. In fact, as soon as Mao died, the then Soviet leader, who was Brezhnev, I think, at that time, 1976, if I remember correctly, said, okay, the ultra-left, ultra-nationalist, deviationist Mao Zedong has died. Now we have rational Marxist leaders in China. We can end the Sino-Soviet dispute. So the Russians, right as soon as Mao died, wanted to end the Sino-Soviet dispute, which was draining their economy and their military, and they needed peace in the sort of Eastern Front. But the Chinese didn't trust the Russians, and then Brezhnev dies, and then it's Andropov and somebody, I forget, and then it's, Gorbachev comes in 1985 and says the same thing. We have new thinking. We want, mutual confidence building and reduction of arms in the East and so forth. And I think the Chinese didn't trust him very much. So, as we did not in the West, because how's this guy talking about new thinking? This is the Soviet Union. So. So Deng Xiaoping put forward 3 obstacles to normalization. The Soviets have to get their troops off of our northern border. They have to stop supporting the Vietnamese invasion of Cambodia and get out of Afghanistan. So at the time that Deng Xiaoping articulated these 3 obstacles, everybody thought that's impossible. But by 1989, for one reason and another, all of those 3 things had actually happened. Now, with respect to China looking at Gorbachev's reforms and saying he's weakening communism, that's the implication of your question. I don't no, I can't say they didn't think that. I just have not seen documentation or academic research that shows that at that time they thought it. After the Soviet Union collapsed, David Shambaugh wrote this great book, which I always forget the name of everybody.
Atrophy and Adaptation.
That's the subtitle, right?
Oh.
Good.
Isn't that the-
That's it. Yeah, that's the book. About how the Chinese then did, in their classical way, put together different study groups, like tell us what went wrong with the Soviet Union. And they studied it, and they found out that, as Xi Jinping summed it up later on, that the Soviets didn't have any, what was the word he used, Han or something, they didn't have any true man to stand up for the mission, communism.
So now let's get into the events of the spring of 1989. Obviously, the proximate cause for all this is the death of General Secretary Hu Yaobang. Keels over during a Politburo meeting. This is a lesson for something we should think about in China today. But keels over and dies. But luckily, there was a succession mechanism existing then.
Yeah.
And his...
Well, he was already out of power. He was, yeah.
Purged in 87 for...
He was still allowed to be in the Politburo,
Yeah.
but he was attending a meeting and had a heart attack.
So why did his death, why did that set off this series of commemorations which built into a political movement? What was it about him, and what was it about the feelings of what started with students and workers in the city in Beijing, but then across the entire country? Why did that set this
So
off?
Hu Yaobang had always been seen as a relatively liberal party leader. He had been the head of the organization department in the post-Mao period and had rehabilitated a lot of people who had been purged during the Cultural Revolution, and he was relatively sympathetic to intellectuals and students and a good listener. And so this, as I said, the 80s were a period of a lot of turmoil, especially the late 80s. There had been Fang Lijie was a hero of students. The students had demonstrated in 86, 87. The conservatives like Chen Yun, Li Xianyan, and others felt that Hu Yaobang, who was then the party secretary, had not dealt harshly enough with and effectively to put an end to these student demonstrations. So that was why Hu Yaobang had been purged. So when he died, the liberals, the intellectuals, and the students and people like that, when a leader of the CCP dies, the party, I forget the exact word for this, but the party has to publish a statement characterizing the person who died either in very, very grand terms, like so-and-so was a great Marxist, or in less grand terms. So for the students, this was their hero. He had been, and now he died, and the students wanted to come out and say, the party must reach an evaluation of Hu Yaobang that is appropriate to how wonderful he was. And so they started small-scale demonstrations to make that pitch, students from Beida, to the party. And that's how it all started, just with that goal, to influence the party's final judgment about the historical role of Hu Yaobang.
As these protests are now mounting in Beijing, but now these are spreading to cities across the country, I wonder if you can put us in the Zhongnanhai leadership compound for a minute and just talk about some of the elements of the debate that are occurring within the party elite about options to deal with this. And I want to use as a maybe a hook here. We've got this infamous April 26th editorial in the People's Daily, right, which really now signals strongly that the leadership is condemning the protesters as rioters, and this was signaling the coming crackdown.
Yeah.
Before there was that clear shift in the leadership, a unity, so to speak, of the leadership, what did the debate look like?
So it kind of goes from unity to division to unity again in a very dialectic manner. Because when the demonstrations started, so when Hu Yaobang was purged, Zhao Ziyang had been moved over from the position of premier handling the economy to become Hu Yaobang's successor as general secretary of the party. So as general secretary, he was the person responsible. They had a division of labor system, not like today when Xi Jinping is responsible for everything. The normal system is that the premier is responsible for the economy and the general secretary is responsible, among other things, for handling this kind of a political crisis like the student demonstration. So Zhao convened some meetings and laid out his plan, which was the students are patriotic and they want to get rid of corruption and things that we also want to get rid of, and they're reasonable. So I've puzzled over this because Zhao's position seems so kind of unpolitical, you know, like from an American point of view where everything is blood on the floor no matter what it is. And I think it's true that Zhao, having been a kind of technocrat in a very tightly organized Communist Party system and in charge throughout his career of economic policy, really wasn't much of a politician. So he actually believed in something that I, as a political scientist, as a realist, think is a little bit naive, which was, okay, the students are patriotic and we can talk to them, and if we have dialogue, they'll, you know, so he presented to his colleagues in the Politburo Standing Committee, which at that time consisted of 5 people, that this is my policy. We're going to have dialogue and acknowledge the students are okay, and then they'll have made their point and they'll disperse. And everybody agreed at that. Nobody disagreed, let's put it that way, because it wasn't their business to disagree, because he was in charge of that problem. He had a scheduled trip to North Korea, and there was some discussion about should he cancel it, but his decision was that this crisis is not that bad, and on the other hand, our relationship with North Korea is extremely important. It wouldn't look good if I canceled the trip. That would send a signal of weakness, and so on. So he left, and at the airport, so in the Tiananmen papers, there's an account of his saying to Li Peng, who was the number 2 guy, all right, I'm going to North Korea, you're in charge, this is my 3-point policy. And Li Peng is like, yeah, I get it, that's the policy, okay. So Zhao Ziyang leaves, I believe, on April 23rd. Well, then, and this is one of the mystery things you mentioned, like what else do we need to know? And I don't know if we'll ever know this, but on April, I think, 25th, Li Peng and I believe the head of public security, Wang Fang, if I remember, visited Deng Xiaoping at his home. Deng never went to the office. Deng was retired. Everybody went to Deng Xiaoping's house and reported to Deng Xiaoping that the students are attacking you. They're shouting against Deng Xiaoping. And Deng Xiaoping, for not, you know, treating Hu Yaobang correctly and so on. And Deng Xiaoping was outraged. So the thing is, did Li Peng trick Zhao Ziyang and say, yes, boss, at the airport, not the airport, I think it was the train, I forget, airport train station, when he had in mind to betray Zhao Ziyang after Zhao left, or in fact, in those couple of days after Zhao left, did Li Peng, in fact, you know, reassess the risk coming from the students, and maybe the students had just started to denounce Deng Xiaoping. I don't know what went on in the head of Li Peng, but he told Deng, the students are calling for your head, they're attacking you by name, and Deng was outraged and said, this is a, what did he say? It's a turmoil intentionally seeking to overthrow our party leadership rule and stuff like that. So then Li Peng goes off and says to the People's Daily, this is what Deng said. Therefore, it's our policy. Because one of the interesting things at this time was that although Deng was retired, the party had previously, in 1988, undertaken a secret resolution that said on all key matters, the senior leaders will have the last word, things we can't manage ourselves, because there was quite a large generation of living senior leaders, and the guys running the system were much younger and didn't have this revolutionary history. So Li Peng was within his rights, I guess, to take Deng's words and have the People's Daily publish them. That was the April 26th editorial. So it kind of cut the legs out from Zhao Ziyang, because if Zhao was right, and nobody knows because that's a what if question, that the students would have left the square. Because there were always students who said, okay, we've done it, let's leave the square. And there were always students who actually left the square, but more came in. If Zhao had been right, the April 26th editorial trapped the students in the square because they now faced a situation in the Chinese communist environment in which if they left the square, they would be picked up one by one on their campuses and punished for what the supreme leader had designated as an attempt to overthrow the party. So they now had to stay in the square, and it's kind of like the Hong Kong students today. I mean, your back is now against the wall. I mean, chances of winning are not very large, but it's worth trying to win because the consequences of not winning are very, very frightening. So the April 26th editorial caught the students in the square, and then Zhao comes back. And this is where there's a long period of division. Zhao comes back from North Korea. He says, I'm back. I'm the general secretary. I still think we should handle this peacefully. I think we should withdraw the April 26th editorial. Li Peng says you can't withdraw it. It's Deng Xiaoping's word. That can never be overturned. And they go back and forth for quite a while.
What was the final straw that convinced the leadership that, why was it June 4th and not June 1st or June 8th? What was
there were a few final straws. One was that Gorbachev visited for this final normalization, and Deng Xiaoping said, we've got to get the students out of the square. This is incredibly humiliating. And the students stayed in the square, and they couldn't. Then they declared martial law. I forget which of these two things came first, but they declared martial law on May 20th. And that was supposed to get the students out of the square, and they didn't get out of the square. So then they, from May 20th, it's hard to say why. My assessment of it is that from May 20th until June 2nd, they were both hoping that the moderate students would win the debate in the square and people would get out, and also they were getting their military operation prepared. And one of the things that we don't have in the Tiananmen papers or any place else is the document traffic in the military side. If you look at the Tiananmen papers, it's all the civilian side, but of course in the military side there's lots and lots of stuff going on, and we don't know what it is, but they obviously needed some time to move forces. There was one general who refused to move, and so there was a process. Why did they not use the People's Armed Police, the paramilitary force, which did exist at that time? And I don't know the answer to that, but I think it's because the scale of the operation was very large, and the PAP was not yet, it was relatively new. I guess they assessed that it couldn't do the job probably. And then on June 2nd, they showed some forces in the city. They had sent some forces out unarmed, and that didn't do it. So I can't quite answer why it wasn't June 3rd or why it wasn't June 5th or something like that, but I guess the troops were ready. The students had been given about 6 weeks of time, and more students were coming in. And by the way, I should mention the students had declared a hunger strike, and the hunger strike had elicited an outpouring of support from non-students in the capital city of Beijing, including government and party employees. So the situation was getting worse and worse. I mean, like in Hong Kong today, you could argue, I'm not so, don't have all the granular details of Hong Kong day by day, but one could argue that fewer people are participating in Hong Kong as time goes by. In Beijing, that was not the case. More people were participating, and of course also Beijing is the national capital. And people participating, as I say, were government and party employees as well as students. So I think I can't answer your question precisely about the date, but there was that trajectory which led Deng Xiaoping finally to say, we've got to bring an end to this. And he ordered Yang Shangkun, who was his sort of number one, equally senior guy, but his number one implementer, and deputy chair of the Central Military Commission to do it.
What's our best estimate of the death toll nationwide?
I can't give one because the only documentary evidence we have is the report by, I think it's the Public Security Ministry, which is in the Tiananmen papers and was published at the time, 282 or something like that. There's no strong reason to trust that, but neither is there any other reliable source. At the time, there were all kinds of estimates, thousands and thousands. And Nick Kristof, who got a Pulitzer, and his wife together got the Pulitzer Prize for their reporting at that time, ran around to hospitals and said, thousands and thousands is much too much. There's no evidence for that, but I wouldn't say that we have a best estimate at this point. There's also this debate about how many were killed in the square, and of course most people, I don't know if any were killed in the square. That's a debate itself, but certainly most of the people killed were killed out of the square in Beijing, and there were people killed in other cities.
So I want to ask a question about Deng having given the final order, final approval. Just want to ask how can we think about Deng Xiaoping? Because that, I think at a superficial level, when we think about Deng, we think of this 4'11" Sichuanese guy who comes to power in 78, grabs the reins from poor Hua Guofeng, and really unleashes this massive nationwide reform to modernize the country, right? And so this intellectual flourishing in the 1980s, this reform and opening. How can we square that with the same individual who at the democracy wall orders it smashed after he sees criticism emerging of himself, and then concluding with 1989 where he shows an iron-fisted willingness. Did he change over time? Was this always Deng? Was he always this contradiction of force and tolerance?
So I alluded before to Deng's belief that you could sort of do two things that we tend to think you cannot do together, have authoritarian modernization, as it were, which apparently is something that Xi Jinping also believed. So I don't think, believes now. So I don't think that, and many, I think as you include among the different streams of thought in your book, there are those Mao left type of people and others who think China can modernize and become rich and great and powerful without being a victim of globalization, without being a victim of corrupt Western liberal thought and stuff like that. So I think Deng's thinking was coherent, even though it's different from our thinking, which is that, but he was crossing the river by feeling the stones in the sense that he would have to zig and zag. I mean, like any politician has to do, I guess, anyway. So when he allowed the democracy wall to flourish, he was trying to get out from under the constraining influence of Maoist, the deadening influence of sort of Maoist conformity. And then when it went too far, he wanted to stop it. And all through the 80s, he was negotiating, partly figuring out a way, which is an intellectual project, and partly just calibrating all the different political forces in the system. So no, I don't think he changed. Ezra Vogel's biography of Deng, I think, is very, Ezra's, one of the strengths of Ezra's academic methodology is to try to put himself into the headspace of the people whose actions he's analyzing. And I think he does a very good job of that. Deng really wanted to modernize China, and he really wanted to keep the one-party system. Why does a person want to keep the one-party system? I think it's because the party really doesn't trust anybody else. Again, I'll refer to the fact that China believed itself, and still does, to be encircled and to be hated by all of its neighbors and the rest of the world. They all want to keep us down. And the Chinese Communist Party really doesn't trust the intellectuals, the technicians, the students, the peasants, the workers, the middle class, because all of those people don't have the vision. So if that's your mentality, which I think is a common mentality of political leaders, is that I know what I need to do and everybody else is in my way, then you don't want to give up the one-party system.
So Jude, can I jump in for a second? So the choices in Tiananmen often are framed as two alternative futures, and one choice was made.
Yeah.
But it seems you're characterizing a much more nuanced frame of reference from the decision-making process. Were they conscious that they were moving away from liberalization decisively and back towards authoritarianism, or is that too simplistic?
So as I said, I think Zhao had a different vision. So after Zhao was placed under house arrest, he did a lot of thinking, and he published a couple things. He gave a bunch of interviews to a friend of his who, after Zhao's death, published a book on Zhao's thought. Zhao also, as I said, recorded these tapes. And Zhao also gave a heap of interviews to another friend of his who has not yet published his work. So Zhao did a lot of thinking and talking. And there's a continuity between Zhao before he was placed under house arrest and after, in his thinking and talking. And the continuity is what I referred to before, that Zhao kind of trusted the people. Deng and most communist leaders and Xi Jinping didn't trust the people. So Zhao was kind of an optimist and thought that we can have a more open system, but he never denounced the idea of a one-party system. But our party should stay in charge, but it should rule in a different manner, more consultative. We can allow more, not complete, but more freedom of the press. We can allow more, but not complete independence of the judiciary. We can allow more, but not complete academic freedom. That was Zhao. So therefore, his vision. So I do think had Zhao been victorious in 1989, China would be quite different today. And it could either be Zhao's vision, which is a much more consultative one-party system, or it could have been what Li Peng said: if we do what Zhao says, the disaster will be. And Li Peng predicted that if we do what Zhao Ziyang says, this was in the debate after Zhao comes back from North Korea, and before the decision for martial law, Li Peng said, the students are demanding dialogue. If we agree to dialogue with the students, where does it stop? We're ruling over 1.3 billion people, all of them selfish, all of them demanding, all of them unreasonable. They're all going to want a dialogue with us. And the communist system will collapse. They actually did have some dialogues with the students, and the students behaved very badly. Li Peng went into this dialogue, and Uar Kaishi was like, and so Li Peng, so yes, there were three futures. The future that we have, the future in which Zhao Ziyang would have been victorious and the system would have collapsed, and the future that you and I would prefer to believe in which Zhao Ziyang would be victorious and China today would be a kind of liberal one-party system, like Japan or something like that.
We're going to go to questions in a minute. I just want to sneak in a couple more questions. How does so there's this new project which you've written an introduction for, this book called The Last Secret, which is some leaked documents of two meetings that immediately following Tiananmen Square. Can you describe the environment in the senior leadership in the days and weeks following? Did they realize the gravity of what had occurred? And were there any emergent splits after they saw the wreckage of the square?
Of course, they did recognize the gravity of what had occurred, that the party had had a near-death experience and had fortunately saved itself. And so about 2 weeks after the crackdown, they held this meeting, and at that point, the Zhao Ziyang point of view, the Zhao Ziyang, I don't want to say faction, but I mean, and what word can we use, liberal or whatever, Zhaoist position was not viable. Nobody articulated it. So the people who had wavered before June 4th, like Wan Li, the chairman of the National People's Congress, so that book that came out called The Last Secret contains statements that were made by a bunch of senior leaders at a meeting 2 weeks after the crackdown. They all said the same thing. The crackdown was necessary. The foreigners were out to get us. The students were misled by bad elements among the intellectuals who wanted to overthrow the Communist Party. They all said the same thing in different flavors and with different reminiscences and some valuable detail. The ones who had been waverers piled on and said the same thing and denounced Zhao. Said, I remember back then I told Zhao this and that and so on. So they got on board. Two younger people who had been working for Zhao and had implemented Zhao's liberal policies at that time said, I was mistaken. I see that now. I admit that I allowed the media to report things, but now when I read what Deng Xiaoping said, I see that I'm politically immature. There wasn't any division, and so the new leadership whom Deng had appointed, Jiang Zemin, as the party secretary and Li Peng continued on as the premier, all got together and implemented a very conservative policy. So the original problem in 1988 is how do we proceed on with reform and globalization and enterprise reform. So after the crackdown, the idea was we don't proceed. We'll keep the state-owned enterprises, we'll keep the command prices, which frustrated Deng, because Deng was modernization, and it's not working. So this is the famous 1992 Deng Xiaoping's trip to the South, where he went to the South and made some visits and some speeches and so forth and said, whoever doesn't reform, what was the phrase that he used? If you don't reform, get out of power, something like that. So Deng in 1992 forced the Jiang Li leadership to abandon their stasis policy and to resume a bold policy of reform. And this is when Zhu Rongji comes in as the premier and is there definitely was debate around Zhu Rongji's reforms, but basically he was able to carry through the reforms, including the entry of China making enough concessions to be able to enter the WTO in 2001, which the American US Trade Rep Office, I think it is, has declared was a strategic mistake on the part of the United States, or somebody did in the federal government officially made that statement. So Zhu Rongji, so when you say after 89, was there a power struggle? There wasn't really a power struggle. There was a period of consensus on no reform, and then after Deng intervened, there was a period of consensus on bold reform, with some disagreement over many details, but no real, nobody really saying we have to stop reform. Mm-hmm. And so they went all out under Zhu Rongji for enterprise reform and globalization and free trade and opening up the entire country to foreign investment and wholly owned foreign enterprises, all of these very, very, what had previously really been unthinkable reforms.
I've got several other questions, but I'm going to unceremoniously end my part because I see there's a stack of
I don't want the
questions.
full burden of censorship, so I'll pick one and then we'll pass them back and forth. So here's one, and thank you, Andy. So some have argued that Tiananmen Square was an opportunity for the United States to support Chinese reformers. But by failing to do so, we reinforce authoritarianism. Another way of phrasing that is how much agency did the United States actually have in these decision-making processes, and to what extent is there evidence that the United States was factored in at all, or could have?
Yeah. And the same question arises today with respect to Hong Kong. And so whoever put that card in there.
I assume there was a...
Who's asking that question? You think we should intervene in Hong Kong. So, well, yes, the US factored in very adversely into the thinking of the leadership in China because they seem to have sincerely believed, and they seem today to sincerely believe, incredible though it is, that the United States has a huge role in fomenting these events of opposition to the leadership on purpose. I mean, we may have a role in fomenting it through soft power or the force of ideas or something like that. But the idea that, so in that time it was George Soros. Soros had opened a small foundation in China, actually under the protection of the Ministry of State Security. And after the crackdown, the Ministry of Public Security, which never liked Soros, reported to the leadership that the Soros Foundation had had a lot to do with it. They blamed the Voice of America. They report. I was going to say obsessively reported, but that's not fair. Every government reports obsessively on what foreign media were saying about the demonstrations in 1989, and of course the foreign media, as today, were very sympathetic to the So the leadership's assessment of the United States was they're rooting for the demonstrators, which is probably correct, and they have a lot to do with supporting it, which is not, so far as I know, not correct, because, and this comes to the point of this question, what might the United States have done? I can't think of anything that we could have realistically done that would have changed the outcome. I mean, are we going to invade China? We're not even going to invade Hong Kong.
It's a good questions here. I have to admit, I'm realizing that we need to invest more in handwriting education and skills. And I'm the first to admit I have a problem in this regard. But some really good questions here, and wish we had 5 hours to get through this, but it just shows the level of interest in this. Has Tiananmen narrative distorted our view of the party by causing us to think of it as reactive and defensive, barely keeping a lid on domestic governance challenges, and leading us to miss the continuity of Beijing's pursuit of its long-term goals?
Yes and no. I think that's a good insight. There is the continuity and long-term goals. And I think I've sort of indicated that in the remarks that Xi Jinping is pursuing, largely speaking, the same goals that Deng did with the same, the sort of alternative modernization, non-democratic modernization. It seems to be doing it very successfully, and using the party, this huge party apparatus, as a core instrument to steer this ginormous political system that he's running, and having the problem of making the whole system work efficiently, that kind of thing. So that is there. However, there is also the fact that that system is subject to periodic eruptions. I guess all political systems are subject to to constant stress, constant latent instability and all that thing. But there's a sense in which the Chinese model of governance, on the one hand, it draws upon the political culture of deference and of familism and of collective values and nationalism and so on. On the other hand, though, it rubs against the grain of something else in the Chinese people. And that something else, to speak in simple-minded terms, is the desire for self-respect, dignity, intellectual autonomy, curiosity, and stuff like that. So it's a repressive system, and there's a degree to which people will conform to a repressive system, and then there are times when people resist a repressive system. And so I think that the questioner's point, both prongs of the question are correct.
I'm going to combine two questions here. These are on historiography. One is asking about, was there an underrepresentation in coverage and research on the role of workers? We keep saying in that period, in the protests, we talk about the students, the students. Yeah. And a similar or related historiographical question is on: is there any scholarship that's looking at the subnational level in terms of provincial municipal newspapers that document? Well, I'll amend this. What do we know about what happened outside of Beijing? Yeah.
I think that's right. There is. The workers did, the demonstrations in the spring of '89 responding to the Beijing events took place in over 300 cities in China, which is a lot. And I don't think there's any scholarship, I can't think of any right now, on Chengdu, Shanghai even, not to mention all the other places. I'm not aware of any.
Well, so I know Louisa Lim in her great book, Republic of Amnesia, does talk about what's happening
in
around
Chengdu, I think.
around the country.
Well, I think, okay, but I don't know of any sort of monographic scholarly research on those events or on the role of workers, and I don't know if there's any way to do it now.
Yeah. This is a related question. In this time of the party's extreme sensitivity to criticisms or alternative historical accounts, also known as historical nihilism, what do you recommend for continued engagement with or of Chinese scholars and intellectuals, particularly those whose research might put them in harm's way?
So I'm not sure what the questioner means, but I definitely think we should be continuing to engage, having Chinese scholars visit as they do, and as visiting scholars, or on short visits. And of course, they are much more frank in conversation than they are in their writing inside of China about history. So we should do that. But
do we put, I know an example, I won't mention it publicly, but I think it's related to someone who tried to get to study with you, a guy who used to work at Yanhuang Chunqiu. Do we put anyone in harm's way by bringing them over here to be working on more robust research on some of these sensitive areas? Of course, it's their own voluntary choice, but is there any harm
to do
in that?
Scholarly work?
Yeah.
There are many different situations. Some people, but no, I don't think so. The Chinese Ministry of Education has a program called the China Scholarship Council, in which, and I think it's a very smart program that they have, in which they pay, and also different universities in China have a similar program in which they pay for PhD students to come out and do a semester or a year, or junior professors to come out and do that. And they have sent people to study with me. Sometimes I think that the people signing the papers don't know who I am. And once or twice—
You don't visit enough.
I don't. And once or twice, the person who came told me that they wanted me to have somebody else sign the invitation, because if my name was on it, they thought they wouldn't be given the grant. But when they come, they study and they're curious, but if they're planning to go back, then they know to write their, say if it's a PhD student, or to write their thing in a way that won't get— they don't seem to get in trouble simply for having come out and spoken to me. There's also this question about whether students and scholars who are on American campuses are being surveilled and having reporting back to them. And of course, I have no way to really know that, but my impression is that that's not happening at Columbia. I don't know why. And people seem to be talking quite freely, even in meetings. And of course in private meetings, very much so. So yes, I don't think we're getting them in trouble. But as you say, if somebody does publish something that gets them in trouble, they know. I always tell them to be careful, but if they are not careful, they know what they're getting into.
Here's a legacy question on how thinking about Tiananmen Square helps or doesn't help us think about emerging issues, and in particular Hong Kong. Where does the history of how the party dealt with protesters, where does that history 30 years ago inform or not how we should think about Hong Kong?
It's very complicated. So certainly the idea that I mentioned before, that there's something in the Chinese people, like there is in everybody else, that resists repression at some point, although it's a big social science mystery about when those things break out. So that's part of it. Also, I think certainly the resolve of the party to not give up one-party rule, but in the case of Hong Kong, also their resolve not to give up on what they call territorial integrity, they're not going to give up on Hong Kong. But the puzzle is, in making that comparison, about the use of troops. And one can explain the use of troops in Beijing. It's the national capital. There's no international protection for it the way there is in the Sino-British Joint Declaration, which is an international treaty that says that China will respect the two systems and all that. So Beijing is in the north, Hong Kong is in the south, and so on and so forth. So there are all these things. And still you would have thought, and I think we all wonder, one would have thought that by this time, how many, 6 months or so? How long has it been that Beijing would have lost patience and would have used force? But they haven't yet. They didn't, and in Beijing, they were pretty patient. I think we would actually have to say, to be very fair and honest, they were pretty patient in Beijing. You know, and Kissinger made the statement afterwards that no government would have been that patient. No other government would have been, you know. So why haven't they used troops in Hong Kong? So one theory that I tend to believe in is that they feel that the Hong Kong elite is loyal to Beijing, and they're not afraid of losing Hong Kong for that reason. Another theory is that, you know, international condemnation. A third theory that I sort of like, but I'm not really qualified to assess it, is that given that it's a very tight urban environment, it's really a police action that has to be done, and that a larger military force that's not really a police force would be, you know, sort of technically would not be able to handle it right. And you'd end up with a sort of Londonderry scenario that they don't want. So I haven't been able to, I don't have the expertise to think it through tactically, but I have a feeling that tactically sending in real troops into Hong Kong would make the problem, you know, would be a bad way to handle it, and they'd prefer to have the police handle it. And they may be sending in people to put on Hong Kong police uniforms and engage in police-type activity. I don't know.
I have a question over text. So will the truth about Tiananmen Square ever come out as long as the Communist Party is in power?
Which truth? The truth has already come out in the Tiananmen papers, but if the person means whether the verdict on
I think they mean will there start to be an accurate historical accounting within China?
In other words, transitional justice kind of
Yes.
thing, an apology, an acknowledgement, and reversal of verdict. No. I don't think so.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think final question, we're getting down to the end here. I just want to know if you can sum up 30 years on, what is the legacy or legacies of Tiananmen Square? How do you think about it today? Why is it important? What does it tell us about where China is going? Where does it tell us about where China is now?
Well, this sort of relates to this question about will there be a reversal of verdict, is I think that and I've already said this, that Xi Jinping sees the world very much the way that Deng Xiaoping and his senior colleagues saw the world in 1989, that China's surrounded by enemies, you can't trust the people. Only the Chinese Communist Party, and not even most of the party but us, can save our great nation and make it into the great nation that it needs to be. So there's that continuity of the mentality of authoritarian modernization. Another way of thinking about the legacy of Tiananmen in a more historical process sense, and this repeats something that I've kind of said, is that, is to say that that by resisting the, let's say, liberal temptation that you kind of alluded to, the party proved that the course of history, they say this in different words, that the course of subsequent history has proven that we were correct not to go down the Zhaoziang road, because look how wonderfully we have succeeded in the years after that. The crackdown was worth it, and it reestablished, it lifted us out of a period of confusion and reestablished our authority, so we've been able to bring China to the point that we find it at now. But we still face the same, and this is what is in this new book called The Last Secret, where they all said, Deng Xiaoping was right to crack down. However, we still face the same enemies that created this crisis, and we must still continue to resist them in the same way that we've resisted them this time.
Seth, any concluding questions, remarks, comments?
Is there anything you still want to know that you don't know after looking at this for a lifetime of research and scholarship?
Yeah. Well, all the military part I would love to know. And
what do you think it would reveal that would change the way you understand events?
well, true. I don't anticipate that would reveal a lot about the big picture we've been talking about, but I think it would reveal something about the timing that you asked about, and this puzzle about why because why deploy the regular military with tanks and rifles into a situation like this? That's a puzzle to me. I mentioned the question about what was Li Peng's real strategy there. Ezra has given his interpretation of what went through the mind of Deng Xiaoping, which Ezra bases upon his interviews with Deng Xiaoping's family and people like that who are sympathetic to Deng Xiaoping. There is an alternative theory that some people think Deng actually put out the April 26th editorial because he wanted to worsen the crisis, because he had grown to suspect that Zhao Ziyang was not loyal to him. You know, in these authoritarian systems, there's always the dilemma of if you don't appoint a successor, there's the risk of a power crisis at some point, as you sort of hinted at, if Xi Jinping has a heart attack or falls off a dais and breaks his left toe or something, then there's a power struggle. But if you appoint a successor, then there's a power struggle with the successor. Deng had more or less appointed Zhao, I mean, not explicitly, but as a successor, and then began to suspect Zhao of having being too full of himself and having an alternative vision. So this is a theory. I don't endorse this theory, but it's a theory that Deng thought, oh, we have the students demonstrating, let's exacerbate the student crisis, and then I can get rid of Zhao Ziyang. So one would love to know much more about these machinations. Really, actually, there were other members of the standing committee involved in these debates, Hu Qili, Qiao Shi, Yao Yilin, we don't know, and then there's Zhao and Li Peng. So we know pretty much about Zhao because he's on the record and Li Peng is on the record, and Li Peng published a memoir, which it's sort of a chronological memoir. But what did Qiao Shi was the head of the whole security apparatus. He was a very, very important person who survived the crisis. And there's not a whole lot about what he's in the Tiananmen papers about, and in a crucial meeting of the 5 standing committee members about, okay, Li Peng wants to crack down and Zhao Ziyang doesn't want to crack down, and they split 2-2, and Qiao Shi abstained. What was his strategy? And despite having abstained, he survives the aftermath and goes on until retirement in 1997. And some people say that his loyalists are still all up and down in the security apparatus all these years later. We know nothing about him. So there's a lot more to know. In the case of China, there's always a lot more to know.
Well, I think transparency and openness are not just requirements for good history, they're requirements for democracy and open societies. And so over the course of your scholarship and helping to edit 2 volumes of leaked documents that allow us a little bit of insight into all of this, you've done your service to all of us. And so
Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.